The deepest part of the night was always the worst. A canyon of cold silence that Dwayne inhabited alone. Outside the small cabin, the tangled pine woods were being smothered by a late winter blizzard. The wind moving through the massive pines with a sound like a grieving ocean. Snow piled in heavy, silent drifts against the windows. He'd insulated himself just months before. His work as a carpenter a constant, quiet battle against the encroaching cold. His cabin, perched at the very edge of the small mountain town, was the last bastion of light before the wilderness truly took over, a single warm ember in a world of white and gray. He lay in bed, the heavy quilt pulled up to his chin, his breath a faint cloud in the frigid air of the bedroom. The fire in the main room stove would be little more than glowing coals by now, a chore he'd have to face in the morning. He was used to the cold. He was used to the silence. It had been 4 years since the cabin held 2 heartbeats. 4 years since the silence felt anything other than absolute. His left hand resting on his chest felt the familiar smooth weight of the wedding ring he still wore. A habit he couldn't bring himself to break. A small cold circle of gold that tethered him to a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. It was the uncharacteristic sound that pierced his rest. A noise so wrong, so out of place in the sterile frozen world that he was instantly awake. It was a sharp metallic scrape, a clatter coming from the kitchen. It sounded like a can falling, followed by the soft, unmistakable thud of something solid hitting the linoleum floor. His heart, which usually beat with the slow, steady rhythm of a man resigned to solitude, hammered once hard against his ribs. He laid perfectly still, straining to hear through the insulating blanket of the storm. Nothing. The wind moaned. But inside the house the silence was back, now heavier, more threatening. He had never been a nervous man, but living alone this far out, you learn to respect the things that broke the pattern. He slid his legs out from under the quilt, his bare feet meeting the freezing wooden floorboards with a silent cease. The cold was a physical shock, a jolt that cleared the last cobwebs of sleep from his mind. He moved without a sound, a phantom in his own home. He pulled on the jeans he'd left on the floor and his thick wool socks, his breath fogging in front of his face. His mind was racing, cataloging. His rifle was too far. He bypassed the bedroom door, moving instead to the dresser. His hand closed around the heavy iron head flashlight. It was long metal and weighed a good 3 pounds. He felt the weight in his hand, a solid, reassuring presence. He was a carpenter, a man who built things. He was not a fighter, but he understood leverage and force. He crept from the bedroom into the small, dark hallway that led to the cabin's main living area. The air was thick with tension. He could smell the cold, the pine from the walls, the faint dying scent of wood smoke from the stove, and now something else. A new sharp coppery scent that his brain couldn't immediately place. Something ancient and cold. It made the hair on the back of his neck prickle. He paused at the edge of the living room, his gaze fixed on the dark maw of the kitchen entryway. He listened again, a shuffling, a soft, wet, rhythmic sound like chewing and a whimper. A low, pained sound that was instantly cut off. His fear was complicated by confusion. A thief wouldn't be stopping to eat. A thief wouldn't be whimpering. He tightened his grip on the flashlight. He reached the kitchen doorway, his back pressed against the wall, his heart a frantic drum. He took a deep, silent breath, and in one fluid motion, he stepped into the doorway and thumbed the flashlight on, sending the blinding white beam into the darkness. He was not prepared for what he saw. The beam found her immediately cornered against the far wall by the pantry. It was not a man. It was impossibly both. And neither. It was a woman, or at least it had the shape of one, but she was wrong, twisted by some inhuman force. She was in the throes of transformation, a terrifying, beautiful, and desperate being caught in the stark white light. Her pale, exposed skin was covered in goosebumps, looking like cold marble, where her clothing, a flannel shirt and jeans, was ripped to shreds. Her clothing offered no protection against the elements. Her chestnut hair was a wild, messy tangle around a face smudged with grime. But her features were heartbreakingly human except for the lips pulled back in a snarl that revealed slightly elongated canines, a little too sharp. And her eyes wide with panic, were a brilliant burning ancient gold, reflecting the beam of his light like cold embers. She was trembling violently from cold, from fear, from starvation. In one hand she clutched a half-eaten loaf of his stale bread to her chest, a desperate, possessive gesture. The pantry door was ajar, the latch clearly broken, forced from the outside. She hissed. It wasn't a human sound. It was a low, pained, guttural sound from deep in her chest, a warning, a plea, a sign of a creature pushed far past its limit. The sound vibrated in the small kitchen, rattling Dwayne to his core. He didn't move. His brain was struggling to process the visual information. This was not a story. This was real. He saw the way the muscles in her arms tensed, ready to spring, ready to fight, or ready to flee. And he knew with a sudden, chilling certainty that she was more dangerous than any beast. But he also saw the desperation. He saw the raw hunger in her ancient gold eyes, a hunger so profound it had driven her to break into a man's house during a blizzard for a loaf of stale bread. He saw the bones under the skin, the lean, strong lines of her body now reduced to a starving, skeletal frame. He saw the shame in the way she tried to make herself small against the wall. Dwayne kept the beam on her, but his hand, which had been raised to swing the flashlight like a club, slowly, almost imperceptibly, lowered. He was a quiet man, and in the quiet he saw things. He saw the long, angry gash on her forearm, caked with dirt and blood, angry and red. He saw the frostbite, the purplish-blue tinge to her fingers. He saw a creature on the absolute edge of survival. He lowered the beam of light further away from her face, pointing it at the floor. It was a gesture of peace. You're starving, he said. His voice, and used for hours, came out as a low, rough rasp, but it was steady. It cut through the tension. The vampire princess woman, Grace, flinched at the sound of his voice. Her snarl faltered, her gold eyes widening in pure disbelief. She had expected pain. She had not expected the quiet, factual statement. Dwayne took a slow, deliberate step back, keeping his movements small, non-threatening. "The bread's stale," he said, his voice a little clearer this time. He nodded toward the stove. "I've got soup canned, but it's hot." He moved with a calm, deliberate purpose. He was not a threat. He was just a man in his own kitchen. He reached up and turned on the small light above the sink. He clicked off his flashlight. Then, in the ultimate act of trust, he turned his back on her. He heard her inhale sharply, a quick shocked gasp, but she didn't move. He kept his back to her as he walked to the stove, took a small pot from the rack, and then went to the pantry. He had to walk toward her to get the can. She pressed herself so flat against the wall that she seemed to merge with the shadows, a low, terrified sibilant sound rumbling in her chest. But Dwayne didn't stop. He simply reached past her, his arm coming within inches of her pale shoulder, and grabbed a can of beef and vegetable soup from the shelf. He could smell her now, that wild coppery scent mixed with a cold, metallic and surprisingly female odor. He grabbed the can and the can opener and walked back to the stove. He could feel her gold eyes burning into his back. He worked the can opener with his rough, calloused hands. The steady rhythmic cat hunk of the metal blade piercing the lid, the only sound in the room. He dumped the contents into the pot, added water, and lit the gas burner, the whoosh of the blue flame, a sudden welcome burst of life. He did all of this without looking at her. Dwayne stood with his back to the creature. He forced his hands to be steady as he stirred the thick, dark soup, the smell of beef and barley filling the small kitchen, a domestic aroma for a situation so profoundly alien. He could hear her, not moving but breathing. The simple act of turning his back on her was the biggest gamble he'd ever taken. He poured the steaming soup into his largest, heaviest ceramic bowl, the clink of the metal ladle sounding deafeningly loud. He grabbed a spoon, tucked it into the bowl, and then taking a steadying breath, he turned around. Grace hadn't moved. She was still pressed into the corner, her gold eyes tracking his every tiny motion. He didn't walk toward her. Instead, he kept his steps slow and obvious, moving out of the kitchen and into the main room. He walked to the wide stone hearth of the fireplace. The hearth was the center of the cabin, the source of all warmth, and he was deliberately, symbolically inviting her into its circle. He placed the heavy bowl on the stone. The steam rose in a fragrant plume. He turned his attention to the fire, giving her a vital, necessary distraction. He knelt on the hearth, his back to her again, and began to work. He added dry kindling, his large, calloused hands moving with practiced economic grace. The fire caught with a satisfying soft whoosh, and a new bright orange light began to fill the room. He stayed there, kneeling, listening. He heard a scrape, a dry, hesitant sound like a nail on the wood floor. He heard a sharp inhale. He didn't turn. He just waited. Grace had watched him. The man Dwayne was an enigma. He should have yelled or struck her or run for a weapon. He had done none of those things. His calmness, his quiet, his deliberate movements, felt like something she couldn't name. And the smell of the soup, it was torture. It was a physical pulling force, a siren song to her screaming, empty stomach. Her body, broken and half-starved, was making the decision for her. Slowly, uncurling her stiff, aching limbs, she crept from the kitchen. She felt the warmth of the new fire hit her face, a shocking, beautiful sensation. She reached the hearth, her gold eyes still locked on the man's broad, unmoving back. She looked at the steaming bowl. Her hunger won. She dropped the stale bread, her hands shaking so violently she could barely function. She grabbed the bowl. It was hot, scalding her frozen fingers, but she didn't care. She didn't even see the spoon. She hunched over the bowl like a starving noble predator, burying her face in the steam and lapped at the hot, thick liquid. It was a messy, desperate sound. She scolded her tongue, gasped, and went right back, using her fingers with unnatural speed and dexterity to scoop the chunks of beef and vegetable, shoving them into her mouth. The warmth spread from her throat to her stomach. A thawing, blooming sensation that brought tears to her eyes. She didn't let them fall. She just ate, her body trembling with the sheer relief of it, her ragged breathing punctuated by desperate, hungry gulps. Dwayne sat in his large armchair a few feet from the hearth. He watched her with a kind of quiet, profound sadness. He was a carpenter, a man who understood how things were built and how they were broken. This creature, this woman, was broken. She was all sharp edges, raw hunger, and deep penetrating fear. But as she ate, he saw something else. He saw the elegant line of her neck when she bent over the bowl. The firelight caught the gold in her eyes and the deep chestnut of her tangled hair, and he found himself thinking with a strange detached clarity that she was beautiful in a terrifying, ruined way. She finished the soup, scraping the last of it from the bowl with her fingers, and then with a quick swipe of her hand she cleaned the inside of the bowl. A wave of shame, so potent it was a physical thing, washed over her. She set the bowl down, her gaze falling, as if expecting the blow that must surely follow such a display. Dwayne didn't say anything. He simply noted the trembling. He rose slowly from his chair, and she instantly tensed, her sharp teeth bared in a silent, warning grimace. He stopped, holding his hands up, palms open. "Easy," he murmured, his voice a low, calm rumble. "You're cold." He pointed to the thick wool blanket folded on the back of his couch. "The fire is good, but that'll help." He didn't move to get it. He waited. He was teaching her moment by moment that he was not a source of sudden movements. She watched him, her gaze flickering from his face to his open hands to the blanket and back. Slowly she seemed to understand. She crept to the couch, snatched the blanket, and retreated to the hearth, wrapping it around her shoulders in one fluid motion. She sank to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest, the heavy wool trapping the heat of the fire. And for the first time she let out a long shuddering sigh, a sound that was almost human. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind, but it was a different silence now. It was a silence of observation. He sat back down in his armchair and they just existed. A man and a vampire princess sharing a fireplace. Two outcasts finding a moment of warmth in the same cold, uncaring world. He needed to break the quiet, to take the next step to pull her the rest of the way out of the desperate entity she had been forced to become. "Got a name?" he asked, his voice casual. She started, her head snapping up. Her golden eyes were wide, surprised by the question. She swallowed, her throat working. Her voice, when it finally came, was a reedy and used whisper. "Grace." The name was a shock. It was a name of such simple human beauty. It didn't fit the immortal being, but it fit the woman he was beginning to see underneath. "Grace," he repeated, tasting the name. "It's a good name. I'm Dwayne." She just nodded, pulling the blanket tighter. The name Dwayne hung in the air. She looked at his hands, rough and large, and then her gaze drifted, drawn by a small glint of light. She saw the wedding ring on his left hand. The simple gold band looked worn, a permanent part of him. A pang of something, a feeling she couldn't identify, twisted in her gut. This kind, quiet man belonged to someone else. It made his kindness all the more confusing. As the warmth of the fire and the soup spread through her, the adrenaline that had been keeping her going for weeks finally began to recede. And with its retreat the pain came roaring back. She winced, a sharp, involuntary hiss escaping her lips as she shifted her arm. The gash throbbed with a dull, hot, angry pulse. Dwayne saw the wince. "You're hurt," he said, his voice flat. Before she could react, he was up from his chair, moving toward the small bathroom off the hall. She tensed, her body coiling, but he returned a moment later with his first aid kit. He sat back down in his armchair, a good 6 feet away, and opened the kit on his lap. "That'll get infected," he said, his voice practical. "The cold's been slowing it down, but the warmth from the fire, it'll make it fester. It'll go bad fast." Grace stared at him. She knew he was right. But to let him touch her, it was a violation. It was a submission. The only touches she had known for a long, long time were ones of violence. Dwayne saw the war in her eyes. He saw the pure, stark terror. He held up a bottle of antiseptic and a clean cloth, his large, rough hand surprisingly steady. "May I?" he asked. The question hung in the air, a profound, fragile thing. He was asking. The choice was hers. She looked at his face. His eyes were a deep, quiet brown, holding a loneliness that seemed to recognize her own. She looked at his callous hands, hands that could probably break her, but were instead offering to heal. He didn't smell like the others, the ones who had hunted her, who smelled of metallic rage and cold, possessive malice. Dwayne smelled of pine sawdust and dark coffee, and a faint lingering scent of a woman's perfume. He smelled safe. He smelled like home. Her body trembling, her mind screaming at her to run, she did the hardest thing she had ever done. She slowly, hesitantly held out her wounded arm. Dwayne didn't move immediately. He just nodded, a small, accepting gesture. He slid his chair closer, stopping just within reach. "This is going to sting," he said, his voice a low apology. He uncapped the bottle, and the smell of the antiseptic was sharp. He poured it onto the cloth, and then his hand, warm and solid, cupped her elbow to hold her arm steady. The touch was electric. Grace gasped. A sharp, choked sound. The retractable talons on her other hand instantly extended, digging into the wool blanket. His skin was hot against hers. Her entire body jolted. A wave of heat, sharp and sudden, pooled deep in her belly. It wasn't just a touch. It was a connection. It was a human man holding the arm of an immortal, and doing so with a tenderness that shattered her defenses. He began to clean the wound, his movements firm, efficient, but gentle. She hissed through her teeth, her whole body rigid. "Shoo," he murmured. "Almost done. You're all right. Just hold still." His thumb, brushing against the soft, sensitive skin of her inner arm, burned where he touched. She was acutely, painfully aware of him. The intense, confusing, intimate feeling intensified, making her whole body feel heavy, her blood thick and hot. He finished cleaning and began to apply a thick antibiotic salve. His fingers, now slick with the ointment, were even more gentle. He wrapped a clean white bandage around her forearm. "There," he said, his voice still low. He didn't pull away immediately. He let his hand rest on her arm for a moment. "That should hold. It's clean." He looked up, his sad brown eyes meeting her golden ones. The space between them was charged, thick with unspoken, impossible things. Dwayne pulled his hand back, the connection broken. He packed his kit, stood, and his large frame seemed to fill the small cabin. "You can have the floor by the fire. You'll be safe here tonight," he said. "The blizzard's not letting up." Grace just nodded, her throat too thick to speak. She watched him walk to the couch and toss the pillow and a thick, heavy quilt onto it. "I'll take the couch," he said. He was giving her the place of honor, the place of warmth, and he was taking the position of the guardian, the sentinel. He busied himself checking the door lock and banking the fire in the stove. And then, with no more ceremony than that, he lay down on the couch, pulling the quilt over him, turning his back to her, a final stunning act of trust. Grace sat on the hearth, wrapped in the wool blanket, her stomach full of hot soup. She watched the broad, still shape of the man on the couch, the man who had seen the monster in her, and had chosen to feed the woman. She curled tighter. She felt the heavy pull of sleep, a truly safe, deep sleep. Her golden eyes grew heavy, and as she drifted off, she wasn't thinking about the hunters or the cold. She was thinking about the strange, confusing, and not unpleasant warmth of Dwayne's calloused hand on her skin. Dwayne did not sleep, not truly. He existed in a state of hyper-aware, shallow rest. His entire consciousness was focused on the woman sleeping less than 10 feet away. He woke, or rather surfaced, to the gray, bruised light of a blizzard-choked morning. The world outside was a roaring, featureless wall of white. His first immediate thought was of her. He turned his head slowly. She was still there. The heavy wool blanket was a mound on the hearth, rising and falling with slow, deep, rhythmic breathing. He couldn't see her face, just a wild tangle of chestnut hair. He noted with a carpenter's eye for detail that the pallor he had seen on her arms last night seemed less pronounced. In the warm, safe air of the cabin in the depths of her sleep, she looked less like a monster and more like a refugee. This cabin had been his fortress of solitude for 4 years. He had just, without thought, invited a secret into that fortress. He eased himself off the couch. He needed to stoke the fire and he needed coffee. He moved to the hearth, his shadow falling over her sleeping form. She didn't stir. He knelt, his gaze lingering on her for a moment. She looked young. A wave of anger, cold and sharp, moved through him. What had been done to her to leave her in such a state? He turned his attention to the fire, adding logs. The fire caught, casting a new, warmer, flickering light across her sleeping face. She whimpered, a low sibilant sound in the back of her throat, and she burrowed deeper into the blanket, turning her face toward the heat. The sound did not frighten him. The kitchen was cold. The memory of the broken pantry latch and her hissing, cornered form came back with a fresh jolt. He ran a hand through his hair. He would have to fix the latch, but first coffee. He filled the old stovetop percolator, his hands steady. He set it on the gas stove. The whoosh of the blue flame was a comforting, familiar sound. He leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, his gaze lost in the swirling white void beyond the window. They were trapped. This was something else. He was trapped in his cabin with a vampire princess. He said the words in his head and they still sounded insane, but the evidence was sleeping by his fire. The smell of rich dark coffee began to fill the cabin, cutting through the cold, metallic scent his guest had brought into the tangle pines. When the coffee was done, he reached into the cabinet for a mug. He paused. He looked back into the main room at the sleeping form. Without allowing himself to second-guess the motion, his other hand retrieved a second mug, one that had belonged to Sarah. He stood there for a long moment, the two mugs in his hands, the weight of the decision, the transition from me to us, settling on him. He poured the black steaming coffee into both and walked back into the living room. Grace woke up not to a sound but to a feeling and a smell. The feeling was warmth. The smell was of wood smoke and something rich, dark and wonderful. Coffee. Her eyes opened, heavy and slow. She was on a warm, smooth floor in front of a blazing, crackling fire. It all came rushing back. The man, the soup, the kindness. The clean, crisp bandage on her arm. It was real. She pushed herself up on one elbow. She felt a wave of human female shame, a feeling so long dormant it was a shock. And then she saw him, Dwayne. He was standing by the window, a solid, broad-shouldered silhouette. As if he could feel her gaze, he turned. His sad brown eyes met hers. He just nodded, then held up the second mug. It was an offering. Her throat felt thick. She pulled the blanket tighter around her chest, covering herself, and she gave a small, hesitant nod. Dwayne walked over. He didn't hand the mug to her. He knelt and placed the mug on the stone hearth within her reach. He respected her. Blizzard's worse, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. We're not going anywhere. She reached for the mug. She looked at her hands. The shift had receded almost completely. Her nails were still thick, strong, and a little too sharp, but her fingers were fingers. The pale, marble-like skin was evident. She wrapped her hands around the hot ceramic. She sipped. The coffee was black, strong, and scalding, and it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. It was a human ritual. Why? She whispered, her voice rough. Dwayne moved back to his armchair. Everyone deserves to be warm, he said finally, because it was the simplest, most honest truth. They sat in silence. She was aware of him as a man, a large, quiet, solid presence that was impossibly not a threat. He was aware of her as a woman, an immortal entity of hidden depths, her golden eyes clear and bright in the morning light, watching him with a new sharp, calculating intelligence. The raw, ancient desire was still there, but it was buried deep beneath layers of trauma and survival. It was the simple awareness of two bodies sharing a small warm space, a male and a female, an unspoken assessment. The knock shattered the moment. It wasn't a knock. It was a pounding. A heavy, furious, demanding sound. Boom, boom, boom. The change in Grace was instantaneous and terrifying. The ceramic mug dropped from her hand, shattering on the hearth, the dark coffee spraying across the stone like blood. She was on her feet in a single blur of motion, a desperate, sibilant cry of pure terror tearing from her throat. The shift was not a choice. It was a reflex. Her eyes flashed crimson, her talons instantly elongated, her spine bowed. She was prey. No, 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 she whimpered, backing away from the door, her golden eyes wide and dilated, her face losing all color in absolute submission. The pounding came again, even harder. Dwayne, we know you're in there. Open up now. The voice was male, muffled, but full of a gravelly, impatient menace. Dwayne was on his feet. He looked at the shattered mug on the hearth. Evidence. He moved quickly, using his foot to kick the larger shards under his armchair. He grabbed the blanket Grace had been using, folded it rapidly, and tossed it onto the couch. He was erasing her. He was protecting his den. Hide, he ordered, his voice a low, sharp, commanding whisper. He pointed up. The loft. Now. His command, his calmness, broke her paralysis. She scrambled, moving with inhuman agility. Her talons scraped on the wood floor. She was up the ladder and had vanished into the shadows of the loft in seconds. She pressed herself flat onto the cold floorboards, her heart a frantic drum. She could smell them even through the thick walls. It was him. The one she had fled, Marcus. He walked to the door, his steps deliberate, unhurried. He was just a carpenter, annoyed at being disturbed during a blizzard. He reached the door, his hand resting on the heavy wooden bar. He took one last steadying breath, and then with a smooth, heavy motion, he slid the bar back and pulled the heavy door open. A wall of white ice and wind slammed into him, blasting into the warm cabin. 3 men stood on his porch, 3 mountains in heavy winter clothing and leather. The one in the lead was Marcus. He was built like a bear, a truly massive man. His eyes were small, black, and utterly devoid of warmth. Dwayne, Marcus grunted. He leaned forward, trying to peer past Dwayne into the cabin. He sniffed, his nostrils flaring, a strangely quick, assessing gesture. "We're tracking a rogue, vicious thing busted into the general store last night, tore the place apart," Marcus said. From the loft, holding her breath so hard her lungs burned, Grace squeezed her eyes shut. A lie. She had been at the general store and stolen a box of crackers, but she had not torn the place apart. They were building a narrative, painting her as an uncontrollable entity to justify the hunt. To justify killing her. Marcus sniffed again, his small eyes narrowing. "Smells cozy in here. You alone, Carpenter?" The question was casual, but the implication was not. Dwayne didn't move. He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, his body a solid, immovable block, preventing any view into the cabin. "What I am is cold, Marcus," he said, his voice flat, his tone bored. "And you're letting all the warmth out." "We found tracks," the second man, Lyle, hissed from behind Marcus. "Her tracks led right to your property line." Dwayne shrugged, a small, dismissive gesture. "Tracks blow away in this. You're tracking a ghost. I've been up for an hour. Haven't seen anything but snow since yesterday." He looked past Marcus. "Whatever you're hunting is probably long gone or long dead by now. You're wasting your time." Marcus's eyes narrowed into tiny black slits. He stared at Dwayne, a long heavy silence stretching between them. Dwayne was just a quiet human. He was harmless, but he was also not afraid, and that bothered Marcus. Marcus took another sniff, a deep pulling inhalation. He could smell the coffee, but underneath it he smelled something else. The faint lingering cold, metallic scent of her, and that faint sharp coppery tang of antiseptic. "You sure, Carpenter?" Marcus said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "It's a bad idea to lie to those who govern. We protect this town." Dwayne met his gaze. His eyes were now as cold, as hard, and as unyielding as the frozen iron of his flashlight. "I'm not in your gang, Marcus, and I'm not lying," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'm cold and I'm busy. I saw nothing. Now, if you'll excuse me, you're freezing out my house." He didn't wait for a reply. He put his shoulder into the heavy wooden door, pushing it against the incredible buffeting force of the blizzard. Marcus, surprised by the sudden, dismissive action, had to take a half step back to avoid being hit. The door slammed shut. Dwayne immediately slid the heavy wooden bar back into place, the thunk of the wood sealing them in, sealing Marcus and his men out. He stood there for a long moment, his back to the door. He was shaking, a fine, deep tremor. It was the adrenaline and the profound seismic shock of his own actions. He had lied directly to the face of Marcus, the unofficial, brutal leader of the gang of hunters that lived on the mountain's edge. And he had done it for an immortal he had known for less than 12 hours. He had chosen. He was in this, whatever this was. He turned from the door, his gaze going to the dark, shadowed opening of the loft. "They're gone," he said, his voice just loud enough to carry. "For now. You can come down. It's safe." He heard a sound from above, a small shuffling scrape. He turned away, deliberately offering her the privacy of his averted gaze as she descended. He heard her feet land softly on the wood floor, a near silent thud. When he turned back, she was standing by the ladder, her body wrapped in the wool blanket. She was trembling not from the cold but from the adrenaline crash. Her form was almost entirely human again. Her skin had regained a healthy pallor, though her golden eyes were still wide, dilated with the fading echoes of her terror. "They'll come back," she whispered, her voice a reedy, broken thing. "Maybe," Dwayne said, his voice practical. "But the blizzard is a friend for now. It's hiding your tracks and it'll keep them from moving too fast." He looked at the shattered mug on the hearth, the dark stain of coffee spreading across the stone. "But we're stuck. This storm is settling in for at least another day, maybe two." The cabin, which had always been his sanctuary, was now a shared cage. The air inside it was thick with a new kind of tension. He knelt, his broad back to her, and began picking up the larger shards of ceramic. He was aware of her watching him, a silent, trembling witness to his quiet domestic act. Grace watched him. He was not panicked. He was not angry. He had just faced down 3 hunters for her. And now he was cleaning up her mess. Dwayne was a puzzle she couldn't solve. He was a provider, a protector. But he was also a man, and her body, which had been in a state of primal asexual survival, was beginning to thaw. It was registering things. The way his shoulders filled out his flannel shirt as he knelt, the size of his hands, the low rumbling timbre of his voice, which impossibly made her feel safe. She was acutely, painfully aware of him. She was also aware of her own filth, her tattered clothes, her weakness. I'm sorry," she whispered. "About the mug." "It was chipped anyway," he said, not looking up. He dumped the pieces into the metal kindling bucket. He stood then looked at her. "Are you hungry?" It was the second time he had asked her that, and the question in its simple, nurturing way was more intimate than a touch. She nodded, a small, shy movement. "All right," he said as if it were the most normal thing. "I'll make something. Bacon, eggs, something hot." He moved to the kitchen. As he moved in the small U-shaped kitchen, the smell of bacon frying in the cast-iron skillet began to fill the air, a rich, smoky, domestic scent. She stayed on the hearth, pulling the blanket tight, watching him. He cracked eggs into a bowl, his large hands surprisingly gentle. He was a builder, a man of solid, steady movements. She felt a deep aching pull toward him, the pull of safety, of warmth, of food. But it was more. It was the profound, deep-seated desire of a creature finding its partner. And that, more than Marcus, scared her because it was a betrayal of the coldness that had kept her alive. Can I do something?" she asked, her voice still small. Dwayne looked up, surprised. He saw the look in her eyes, that desperate need to not be useless. "The coffee. I need to make more," he relented. "The pot is there." Slowly she stood, letting the blanket drop to her shoulders like a cape. She walked into the kitchen. Her tattered appearance was a stark, brutal contrast to the homey, pine-walled room. He was acutely aware of her proximity. He was at the stove. She was at the counter, their backs separated by maybe 2 feet of air. The space was charged, hot, and thick with the smell of food. She fumbled with the percolator, her hands, still more used to talons than coffee grounds, shaking slightly. She needed the jug of water. "Excuse me," she whispered. Dwayne didn't move fast enough. He turned and she was there, closer than he had anticipated. Her shoulder brushed against his chest. It was nothing. It was everything. It was the first non-clinical, non-violent contact they had made. A jolt, like a live wire, passed between them. He felt the softness of her through his shirt. She felt the solid, warm wall of his chest. They both froze for a fraction of a second in a state of shared, breathless shock. Her golden eyes, wide and startled, flew to his. He saw the panic in them, but he also saw a spark, a flicker of heat. He stepped back, his heart hammering for a reason that had nothing to do with Marcus. "Sorry," he muttered, turning back to the bacon. It's fine," she stammered, grabbing the water jug. The rest of the breakfast preparation was done in a thick, vibrating silence. He put a plate of bacon and scrambled eggs on the small wooden table. He gave her the larger portion. They sat on opposite sides of the table. They ate. "This is good," she said finally, her voice small. "Thank you." "It's just eggs," he replied, but he was pleased. The simple act of sharing a meal was more intimate than any conversation. After they ate, a new awkward tension set in. Grace stood, gathering the plates. She had to do this to prove she was not just a burden. I'll wash," she said, a statement, not a request. Dwayne nodded, understanding her need. "The water in the jug is for drinking. The sink water is just melted snow." "It's cold," he warned. She didn't care. She took the plates to the small kitchen sink. Her back to him. She began to wash, her movements clumsy, fumbling with the slick ceramic plates. She was scrubbing one of his heavy plates, her knuckles white, when her hand, stiff and unused to the task, simply slipped. The plate fell from her grasp. It hit the edge of the sink and then the floor with a loud, catastrophic shatter. She didn't move. She just froze, her entire body rigid, her breath catching in her throat. The sound of the breaking plate was like a gunshot. It was the sound of her failure. It was the sound that in her old life would have been met with a snarl, a cuff, or worse. She squeezed her eyes shut, her whole body cringing in absolute shame. She was waiting for the yelling. She was waiting for the anger. She was waiting for him to finally confirm that she was the monster, the rogue, the vicious thing that broke everything she touched. Dwayne was on his feet in an instant, not in anger, but in concern. He saw her. Her back was to him, but her posture was that of a terrified, beaten captive. She was braced for a blow. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He stopped his own brief flash of annoyance, replacing it with a deep, profound ache. He walked slowly into the kitchen, his steps deliberately heavy. He went past her, grabbed the small dustpan and brush and knelt. He didn't say a word. He just began to sweep up the pieces. He could feel her trembling, radiating shame. "It's fine," he said, his voice low, steady. "Just a plate." She didn't move. He swept the last of the shards into the pan. Then he stood. He looked at her, at her hunched shoulders. He had to reach her. A small and used smile touched the corners of his mouth. "You're a lousy dishwasher, Grace." It was the last thing she ever expected. It was a joke. A small, absurd human joke. A noise. A sound she hadn't made in months bubbled up from her chest. It was a choked, half-sobbing sound that halfway out turned into a laugh. It was a rusty, surprised sound, but it was a laugh. It shocked her so much that she turned, her wide golden eyes still wet with unshed tears, staring at him in disbelief. He was smiling, a small, sad, kind smile. I'm sorry, she said again, but this time a small answering smile, a flicker of one, touched her own lips. Don't be, he said, his voice gentle. I've got more. The intimacy of that shared broken plate laugh, the way it had shattered her terror, was more potent, more real than the accidental electric touch. The tension was gone, replaced by a new, softer, more comfortable quiet. I'll be more careful, she offered, her voice still shaky. Don't worry about it, he said. He dumped the pieces and put the dustpan away. The immediate crisis was over. The cabin was quiet again, just the wind and the fire. She was less spectral, more human than he had ever seen her, and she was watching him. She was looking at the photograph on the mantel. Dwayne, younger, his arm around a woman with a wide, bright smile, Sarah. She was beautiful, Grace said, her voice soft. Dwayne, who had been watching the fire, started. Yeah, he said, his voice thick. She was. Grace just watched the fire, her golden eyes reflecting the flames. It's hard, she said, not as a question but as a shared truth, being alone. He looked at her, truly looked at her. A vampire princess, a refugee, a creature of the shadows, and she had just cut right to the core of his entire existence. It has been, he said, the admission costing him. It's been for years. She just nodded, a slow, understanding gesture. She accepted his truth and sat with him in it. In the small, warm cabin, two outcasts, a man who had lost his world and a woman who was hunted by hers, sat by the fire, the shared, unspoken confession of their loneliness, a fragile, new and terrifying bond between them. The second day of the blizzard found the cabin in a state of suspended animation. The storm had intensified, sealing them in. The hours had passed in a strange, charged quiet. Dwayne had given her one of Sarah's old sweaters and a pair of his own wool socks. The cabin was warm, the air thick with the scent of pine, brewing coffee, and the faint, musky and undeniably female scent of Grace herself. But as the pale gray light of the second day began to bleed into early twilight, the fragile peace began to splinter. Grace had become restless. The quiet, watchful woman was gone, replaced by a being of tightly wound, ancient anxiety. She began to pace, her movements tight, her muscles bunched under the borrowed sweater. She was hot, her skin flushed, and her breathing was becoming shallow, almost panting. She would stop, her head cocked as if listening to a sound he couldn't hear, a low, pained moan escaping her throat. Dwayne knew with a sinking practical certainty that this was not a normal sickness. The hidden oppressive weight of the blood tide, buried though it was by a mile of swirling cloud and snow, was a poison in the air, a tidal pull on her blood. Her human form and her true nature were locked in a painful, feverish stalemate. Grace, Dwayne said, his voice quiet. He moved into her path, forcing her to stop. She flinched, her golden eyes wide and unfocused. What's wrong? He asked and reached out, his hand large and warm, placing it on her forehead. She was burning. She gasped, a sharp, choked sound. You're on fire, he murmured, his hand a grounding, steady weight. She whimpered, a low, agonized cry of pure misery. I don't, she panted. It hurts. Her hands, her talons which were trying to force their way through her human skin, flew to her throat, tearing the collar of the borrowed green sweater. The soft wool ripped, exposing the pale, sweat-licked skin of her shoulder and collarbone, and he saw it. Dwayne's breath caught in his chest. His gaze was locked on the ruined flesh, a brutal, ragged and unnatural scar. It was shaped impossibly like a claw, 3 deep parallel lines gouged into her. It was a brand, a mark of ownership. This was the reason for the hunt. His mind, so practical, filled with a sudden, cold and utterly silent fury. His voice, when it came, was the quietest, most dangerous sound she had ever heard, a whisper of cold, hard steel. Who did this to you? She saw where he was looking. Her hand flew up to cover the mark, a gesture of pure instinctive shame. It's nothing, she stammered. It's from a bear, she lied. Dwayne's eyes never left her face. His silence was a demand for the truth. And she broke. A dry, racking, agonizing sob tore from her throat. Marcus, she whispered. He was supposed to be my mate. It was an arrangement. I refused. He didn't like that. He said I was his property whether I wanted it or not. He did this. He marked me. He said it would show everyone who I belonged to. Her voice broke. I ran that night. He called me rogue. He told his hunters I was vicious. He's been hunting me to drag me back or to kill me. Dwayne stood perfectly, dangerously still, absorbing every word. This was the story of a woman, A young, terrified woman fleeing a brutal, violent, and possessive abuser. The vampire princess part, it was suddenly, shockingly irrelevant. She was a victim and he felt a purpose. He felt rage. He stepped forward and Grace flinched, expecting the blow. But Dwayne walked right into her space, his large, warm, solid presence surrounding her. He reached out, his fingers shaking almost imperceptibly, and gently, deliberately moved her hand away from the scar. His fingers, warm and rough, brushed against the ruined, raised flesh. She hissed, expecting pain, but his touch was not one of possession. It was a touch of witness, of acknowledgement. He looked from the scar to her terrified, golden, tear-filled eyes. "No one," he said, his voice a low, gravelly, and utterly final primal snarl, a sound of deep, protective fury she had never heard from Marcus, "will ever touch you again." The words, his touch, it was the breaking point. This man, this human, had just claimed her not as property, but as something to be protected. The fever, the fear, the rage, it all coalesced into a single, overwhelming and terrifying new sensation. Need. A profound, aching, and elemental need for him. She leaned into his hand, pressing the scar into his palm, a nonverbal plea. The air between them was a pure combustible electrical field. He was so close. His own breath was unsteady, his gaze dropping just for a second from her eyes to her mouth. He recognized the raw, deep, and profoundly female heat radiating from her. He lowered his head, his own movements slow, hesitant, giving her a choice. Grace did not take it. Every instinct, new and old, human and immortal, was screaming at her that this man was safe, that this man was hers, that this man was home. She met him. She didn't wait. She surged up, her hands coming up to grip his flannel shirt, and she crashed her mouth against his. It was not a kiss of romance. It was a collision of desperation, of starvation, of two bone-deep, lonely outcasts. His initial shocked stillness lasted only a second before his own, long-buried need roared to the surface. His hand left her scar, his other arm snaking around her waist, pulling her in. A growl, a low male sound of possession, and a long-starved hunger rumbled in his chest. His mouth opened against hers, taking, claiming, answering. It was hot and needy and a promise and a rescue. The kiss was a drowning. His hands, those calloused carpenter's hands, were moving with a desperate, possessive instinct. He tasted the salt of her skin, the unique wild musky flavor that was purely Grace. For Grace, the world had contracted to this single point of contact. The fever, the fear, the pain, it all vanished. Her talons were forgotten, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. It was a kiss of shared, profound starvation, confirming they were both still alive, and both, after so long, devastatingly, achingly alone. The world shattered, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a literal, violent explosion of wood, ice, and sound. There was no knock. There was no warning. There was only a catastrophic splintering crash as the heavy wooden bar was broken in two, the door itself slamming open, torn from its lower hinge. A wall of white, a physical, tangible blast of snow, ice, and hurricane-force wind erupted into the cabin. They were torn apart, stumbling back. Dwayne, his body instantly moving to shield Grace, stared at the ruined doorway. There stood a creature of power and malice, framed against the swirling white chaos, a man draped in leather and ice. Marcus, his massive bear-like form filling the doorway, his small black eyes burning with a triumphant, righteous, and utterly terrifying fury. He was flanked by Lyle and a third hunter. Marcus's gaze swept the room. He saw the scattered broken shards of the coffee mug. He saw Dwayne in the center of the room, his face flushed, his shirt rumpled. And then his gaze locked on Grace. He saw her not as the terrified entity she had been, but as a woman in a human's cabin, wearing Sarah's sweater. He saw the torn collar, the pale, flushed skin of her shoulder underneath, and his face darkened with a purple, possessive, and utterly brutal rage. The lie in Dwayne's calm eyes, the scent of antiseptic, the broken bar, all were confirmed. "The blizzard is over," Marcus snarled, his voice a low, satisfied and brutal sibilant threat as he took a heavy thudding step into the room. His black eyes slid from Grace to Dwayne and back to Grace, his lip curling in prideful contempt. "You'd hide behind a human?" he spat. "You defile yourself mine?" Dwayne did not hesitate. He placed himself directly between Marcus and Grace, a human shield. "Get out of my house," he said. His voice was flat, cold, and utterly dead, a voice of final warning. Marcus looked down at him, laughing, a short, sharp barking sound. "You," he snorted. "And what army, Carpenter?" He raised his massive gloved hand and shoved a casual, dismissive backhanded blow. Dwayne took the blow on his shoulder, stumbling, but he stayed on his feet. The move was a feint. Marcus lunged not at Dwayne but at his property. It was the opening Dwayne had been waiting for. He dove for the hearth, his hand plunging into the red-hot embers. His fingers closed around the iron handle of the fireplace poker. The tip was a bright, glowing, angry red. "Take care of him," Marcus hissed over his shoulder to his two men. Lyle and the wiry man turned to end the carpenter. They moved too slow. Dwayne came up from the hearth, his face a mask of cold fury, the poker in his hand. Lyle lunged first. Dwayne sidestepped and drove the red-hot iron poker forward like a spear. The glowing tip met Lyle's shoulder, punching through his thick leather jerkin. The man's grin vanished, replaced by a look of pure, uncomprehending shock, before his mouth opened in a silent, agonizing scream. He went down, clutching his smoking, ruined shoulder. But Marcus was furious. He spun, his speed belying his size, and he swung. The blow, a rock-hard fist, caught Dwayne square on the side of the head. Dwayne's head hit the sharp wooden corner of the firewood box with a sickening wet crack, and he went down sprawling, his vision exploding in blinding stars. The poker clattered uselessly across the floor. Marcus turned back, the problem of the carpenter solved. He stalked slowly toward Grace, who was frozen by the hearth. "He was a nice try," Marcus snarled, his voice a low, terrifying purr. "But he was just a man." He lunged fast, his massive hand closing on the front of her torn sweater, and he lifted her off her feet. "You are mine. You are my property," he hissed. And that was his mistake. He had brought her close. Grace saw over Marcus's massive looming shoulder the unmoving form of Dwayne. She saw the dark, ugly red blood staining the pine floor of his house. And the terror, the fear, the lifetime of being prey did not just break, it erupted. It was replaced by a white-hot volcanic and utterly elemental female rage. "No," she hissed. The sound was a low, savage, and utterly lethal vow. It was a transformation of war. Her body, which had been fighting the fever, now welcomed the change. Her nails, in a single excruciatingly painful and utterly satisfying instant, elongated, sharpening into thick, dark, razor-sharp talons. She raged. Her hand opened, and with all of her strength, she tore her talons down the side of Marcus's face. 4 deep, parallel bleeding furrows. Marcus howled. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated, and shocked agony. He recoiled, releasing her. Grace dropped to the floor, landing on her hands and knees, a low, murderous sound ripping from her throat. She was a warrior. She was a guardian. She was ready to kill him. Dwayne on the floor was pulled back by the sound. He saw through his one good eye Marcus stumbling back, blood pouring through his fingers. He saw Grace not as a victim but as a predator, a 4-limbed fanged defender. And he saw the third man who was moving to stab her in the back. The firewood box was right there. Dwayne, his head screaming in protest, grabbed the single heaviest log of oak. He lunged from his knees, a low carpenter's lunge, and he swung the log like a baseball bat into the back of Marcus's leg right behind the knee. The sound was a low, wet, and utterly sickening crack, the sound of a large bone snapping in two. Marcus bellowed, a sound of pure, systemic agonizing shock as his leg folded in the wrong, unnatural direction. He went down. The fight was over. The wiry hunter, his knife still raised, his gaze flickering from the fanged woman with the bloody talons to the carpenter on his knees, was done. He dropped his knife, grabbed the whimpering Lyle, and began to drag him backward out of the ruined doorway into the blizzard. Marcus, his face a river of blood, his leg a ruined, useless thing, glared at them even in defeat, burning with a promise of pure murder. You'll die for this." He howled as he dragged himself out, leaving a thick trail of his own blood on Dwayne's clean wooden floor. Dwayne staggered to his feet. Grace was at his side in an instant, her rage replaced by a new, fierce protective energy. Together, a partnership of two, a carpenter and a vampire princess, they shoved the heavy, broken door back into its frame. Dwayne slammed the splintered bar into its shattered brackets. The final definitive thunk was the loudest, most beautiful sound in the world. The cabin was a sudden roaring vacuum. The agonized cries, the wet crack of bone, all gone. Dwayne leaned his exhausted weight against the broken door. "Grace," he rasped. The sound of his voice broke the spell. Her head snapped toward him. She saw the blood. She saw the unnatural, dazed way he was leaning against the door, and the volcanic fury transformed. It shifted in an instant from a weapon of war to a tool of care. The low sound in her throat died, replaced by a low, anxious, and utterly feminine whimper. "Dwayne," she whispered, the name a breath of pure terror. You're bleeding." She rushed to him. His knees finally gave out and he folded, a heavy, boneless weight, but she was there, her small, strong body catching him. "You are not fine," Grace commanded. "The chair, now sit." With a strength born of her unique, true nature, she half-dragged, half-guided his stumbling form across the small, wrecked room and deposited him into his armchair by the hearth. She was a medic. She grabbed his first aid kit. "Hold still," she commanded. She looked at his wound, an ugly, deep 2-inch gash above his temple. This is going to sting," she said, the exact words he had said to her. Her small, warm hand cupped his jaw, tilting his head. Dwayne stopped fighting. "Okay, Grace," he whispered, a sound of pure, absolute surrender. The antiseptic was a searing fire, and he hissed through his teeth, his large carpenter's hand flying up to grab her free arm in a bone-tight, agonizing grip. Grace didn't pull away. She just held him, absorbing his pain, murmuring a low, soothing comfort. "It's all right. I've got you." She finished cleaning and bandaged his head. When she was done, her hands, smeared with his blood, rested on his jaw and shoulder. Dwayne, his world slowly coming back into focus, opened his eyes. He looked into her golden, beautiful, and now human eyes, which were filled with overwhelming tenderness. "You're hurt," he whispered, looking at the blood on her hands. "So are you," she whispered back. Her hand traced the line of his lower lip. It was the most intimate, intentional touch of all. He turned his head slightly and pressed a kiss, a slow, gentle, and utterly devastating kiss into the palm of her hand, the one that was smeared with his own blood. Grace's breath hitched. That simple, reverent gesture was more profound than the desperate kiss before. She leaned in, her body moving, and she kissed him. This was the real kiss. This was a joining. It was slow. It was deep. It was a promise and a home. His mouth softened under hers, accepting, welcoming. His hands came up to her hands, holding them as she kissed him, a quiet, gentle, and utterly possessive gesture. It was a kiss that healed. They'll come back," Grace whispered, the old, lingering fear a shadow in the back of her mind. Dwayne, his head and heart clearer than it had been in 4 years, looked through the splintered doorway. "No," he said, his voice a low, certain, and utterly final rumble. "He won't." He looked back at her. "He has a broken leg, Grace. Lie has a bad burn. The wind chill is deadly there. The wilderness has passed its own sentence." Grace let out a shuddering, sobbing sigh of pure, unadulterated relief. She leaned into him, her head finding the natural hollow of his shoulder, her arms wrapping around his neck, holding on in a final act of arrival. She was home. Dwayne's arms, his strong carpenter's arms, came up, holding her. He reached his left hand up. He didn't look at it. His fingers fumbled with the simple, smooth, and cold gold band. He looked at the mantel, at Sarah's photograph. He felt not guilt, but a quiet, profound gratitude. He slipped the ring off his finger. The skin underneath was pale, indented, a ghost of the metal. He placed the ring, his past, gently, lovingly on the mantel, right in front of her photograph. It was an end. He leaned back, his left arm bare, new and strong, wrapping around Grace's shoulder, pulling her tighter. He was no longer the widower of the Tangled Pines. He was just Dwayne. Grace, feeling the shift, the finality of the movement, snuggled deeper, a low, contented sound rumbling in her chest. The sun, a real, true and golden sun, now broke through the clouds, streaming through the broken, ruined doorway, bathing them at last in a new and very, very warm light.